At my sister's wedding, I looked down at my name tag and saw two words that made the entire ballroom disappear around me. Poor relative. For a moment, I simply stared at the card in my hand, wondering if I had read it wrong. But the elegant black lettering didn't change. It remained there, neat and deliberate, as if someone had spent extra time making sure those words would be impossible to miss. My name wasn't on the front. Not Eleanor Hayes. Not sister of the bride. Just poor relative. I smiled. Then I pinned it to my dress and walked inside. I'm 68 years old. By that age, you learn that not every insult deserves an immediate response. Sometimes silence reveals more than anger ever could. The wedding was being held at a beautiful country club outside Asheville, North Carolina. The ballroom overlooked rolling green hills, and sunlight poured through towering windows that stretched nearly 20 feet high. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above perfectly arranged tables covered in ivory linens. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked carefully planned, including my humiliation. As I stepped into the reception hall, I noticed a few guests glancing toward my name tag. Some looked confused. Others looked amused. One woman covered her mouth to hide a smile. Another whispered something into her husband's ear before both of them turned to look at me. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but I kept walking. My younger sister Linda had always loved appearances. Growing up, she cared deeply about who wore the nicest clothes, who drove the newest car, who lived in the largest house. Even as children, she measured worth through visible success. I had spent most of my life believing she would eventually outgrow that habit. Standing in that ballroom, I realized she never had. Eleanor. Linda's voice floated across the room. She approached in an elegant cream-colored gown, smiling brightly for everyone to see. She kissed my cheek and stepped back. Her eyes immediately drifted to my name tag. For a brief second, I thought I saw satisfaction flash across her face. Then it disappeared beneath a polished smile. "I'm so glad you made it," she said. "Wouldn't miss my little sister's wedding," I replied. She laughed lightly. Little sister. Linda was 64 years old, yet somehow she still enjoyed being treated like the center of every room she entered. "I hope you're comfortable," she said. "We've assigned seats very carefully." Something about her tone felt rehearsed. Before I could respond, another guest approached and congratulated her. Linda drifted away without another word. I watched her move through the crowd, accepting compliments and attention as naturally as breathing. Nearby, a server offered me a glass of sparkling water. I accepted it and quietly found my table. The place card waiting there carried the same label as my name tag. Poor relative. This time I noticed several people seated nearby, trying not to stare. One man actually chuckled. "Interesting sense of humor," he said. I smiled politely. "I suppose so." Inside, however, old memories were beginning to stir. Memories of family dinners where Linda casually mentioned my modest car. Memories of holiday gatherings where she introduced me as the practical one, the simple one, the sister who never cared much about money. None of them knew the truth. That wasn't because I had hidden it particularly well. I simply never talked about it. My late husband's family had taught me something valuable many years ago. Real wealth doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need applause. It certainly doesn't need validation from relatives. Across the room, laughter erupted near the bridal party. I watched Linda raise a champagne glass as guests surrounded her. She looked happy, victorious, even, as though she believed she had successfully established everyone's place in the family hierarchy. Rich relatives over here, poor relative over there. Simple, easy, settled. I took a slow sip of water and glanced once more at the card resting beside my plate. Poor relative. The words no longer hurt. Instead, they made me curious. Curious how far this performance would go. Curious how many people had participated. Curious whether Linda truly believed the story she had spent years telling everyone about me. Because if she did, she was about to discover something that would change the entire evening. And by the time this wedding was over, nobody in that ballroom would ever look at that name tag the same way again. For the next hour, I watched the reception unfold like a carefully rehearsed play. Everywhere I turned, there were small reminders that someone had decided who belonged and who did not. The guests drifted between tables, balancing plates of food and glasses of champagne, while a string quartet played softly near the windows. Conversations rose and fell like waves. Yet every so often, I would catch someone glancing toward me, then quickly looking away. It was not hostility. It was something worse. Pity. The kind of pity people reserve for someone they believe has fallen behind in life. A woman seated across from me introduced herself as one of Linda's longtime friends. She smiled warmly enough, but her first question told me everything. "So, Eleanor, are you retired?" I nodded. "I am." She leaned forward. "That must be difficult these days. Everything is so expensive." Before I could answer, another guest joined in, especially for people on a fixed income. They both looked at me with the gentle concern normally reserved for fragile relatives. I simply smiled and took a sip of water. Neither of them knew that I could have purchased every table in that ballroom without making a dent in my finances. But correcting them seemed unnecessary. Across the room, Linda moved from group to group, glowing beneath the attention. Every laugh seemed slightly louder when she was speaking. Every story somehow circled back to her. I had seen this pattern my entire life. Even as children, she had a talent for becoming the center of any gathering. At family reunions, she told stories while everyone listened. At holidays, she arranged the seating, directed the conversations, and decided which memories deserved repeating. People rarely questioned it. They simply accepted her version of events. Over time, that version had quietly reshaped the way they saw me as well. The practical sister, the quiet sister, the sister who never amounted to much. As dessert was served, I noticed something else. Several guests were wearing custom ribbons attached to their place cards. Family, bridal party, close friends. Mine carried no ribbon at all, only that same label. I ran my finger along the edge of the card and almost laughed. The effort behind it was impressive. None of this had happened by accident. Someone had planned every detail. Someone wanted the message to be impossible to miss. "Are you all right?" a familiar voice asked. I looked up and saw Grace Monroe standing beside my chair. Her silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight, and her expression told me she had already noticed everything. Grace and I had been friends for nearly 30 years. She understood me well enough to recognize when I was remaining quiet by choice rather than weakness. "I am fine," I said. She glanced at the card beside my plate. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That is remarkably cruel." I shrugged. "It is also remarkably revealing." Grace pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the crowd. Finally, she leaned closer. "You should know something." Her voice remained calm, but I could hear concern underneath it. "I overheard Linda speaking with Robert earlier." My attention sharpened immediately. Grace lowered her voice even further. "They were discussing money." I remained silent. "Not their money," she continued. "Yours." A slow chill moved through me. Across the ballroom, Linda raised her glass and smiled for another photograph. She looked completely at ease, completely confident. And for the first time that afternoon, I began to suspect that this wedding was not the real reason I had been invited. I kept my eyes on Linda as Grace's words settled heavily in my mind. For years, I had learned not to react too quickly when something felt wrong. Time has a way of revealing what emotions often hide. Across the ballroom, my sister was laughing with a group of guests near the dance floor. She looked relaxed, confident, completely unaware that a single conversation overheard by the wrong person had begun to unravel the image she had carefully built all afternoon. "What exactly did they say?" I asked quietly. Grace folded her hands together on the table. "I only heard part of it," she said. "But Robert mentioned that you had always been responsible with money. Linda said that made you the perfect person to help family when the time came." I looked down at the untouched slice of wedding cake sitting in front of me. The white frosting was decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Beautiful on the surface, much like this wedding. "Help family," I repeated. Grace nodded. "Then Robert asked if you knew anything yet." Linda told him not to worry because you still believed everything was about celebrating family. I felt a small ache somewhere deep inside me. Not because I was surprised, because I was not. Looking back, there had been signs. Small moments scattered across the years like puzzle pieces nobody expected me to connect. Linda had called more often during the past 6 months than she had in the previous 6 years. She suddenly wanted lunch dates, holiday visits, long conversations about family memories. At first, I had convinced myself she was becoming sentimental as she grew older. Now I wondered if something else had motivated the change. The band began playing a slow instrumental piece while servers cleared dessert plates. Around me, guests chatted comfortably. Nobody seemed aware of the quiet shift taking place inside my mind. One memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 8 months earlier, Linda had invited me to dinner at her house. During the evening, she casually asked whether I had updated my estate plans. At the time, I found the question strange but harmless. She had followed it with several comments about how difficult retirement could become for people without proper support. I remembered smiling and changing the subject. Tonight, that conversation felt different. It felt deliberate. "There is more," Grace said softly. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I also heard Linda mention a business investment." I waited. Apparently, she and Robert invested heavily in a real estate project last year. A cold understanding slowly began to form, and it did not go well. Grace shook her head. From what I gathered, it went very badly. For a moment, the sounds of the reception seemed distant. I watched guests, laughing beneath crystal chandeliers while a photographer moved through the crowd, capturing perfect moments. Everyone saw celebration. I was beginning to see desperation hiding underneath it. Linda had spent the entire afternoon presenting me as someone insignificant, someone unsuccessful, someone beneath the rest of the family. Yet according to Grace, she might also be hoping I would solve a financial problem she could not solve herself. The contradiction was almost impressive. My gaze drifted toward the head table where Linda stood preparing for another round of photographs. She smiled brightly as cameras flashed around her. Looking at her now, I realized something important. This wedding was not the stage she believed it was. She thought she was controlling the story. She thought she had already assigned everyone their roles. What she did not understand was that the truth had a way of arriving quietly, and once it arrived, it rarely left anyone unchanged. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the reception became louder, brighter, and somehow more revealing. The dance floor filled with guests while servers circulated with trays of coffee and small desserts. From a distance, everything looked perfect. Yet once I started paying attention, I noticed cracks beneath the polished surface. Linda's smile appeared a little too forced whenever money entered a conversation. Robert laughed a little too quickly whenever someone mentioned business. Tiny details, easy to miss unless you had spent an entire lifetime studying people you loved. Grace eventually excused herself to speak with another guest, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat quietly, watching families gather around tables and pose for photographs. It should have been a joyful scene. In many ways, it was. Sophia looked radiant. The young couple seemed genuinely happy. That made the situation even more disappointing. Somewhere along the way, what should have been a celebration had become something else. I found myself thinking about my late husband, Charles. He had possessed an extraordinary ability to understand people without judging them. Whenever someone acted out of greed, fear, or insecurity, he would simply say, "Money does not change character. It reveals it." At the time, I thought it was an elegant phrase. Sitting in that ballroom years later, I realized how accurate it truly was. Most people assumed my financial situation was modest because I lived modestly. I drove a 6-year-old sedan. I lived in the same comfortable home Charles and I had shared for decades. I clipped coupons when they made sense. I compared prices at grocery stores. Not because I needed to, because I saw no reason not to. Wealth had never felt like an identity to me. It was simply a responsibility. The trust established after Charles passed away had grown steadily over the years through careful management and patient investing. I rarely thought about the number itself. $12 million sounded dramatic when spoken aloud, but in my daily life, it changed very little. I still woke up each morning, made my own coffee, watered my garden, and called friends I cared about. What mattered was freedom. Freedom from worry. Freedom to help when help was truly needed. Freedom to say no when necessary. A burst of laughter pulled me back to the present. Near the head table, Linda was speaking to a group of relatives I had not seen in years. Several of them turned toward me. One man gave me a sympathetic smile. Another nodded politely. The expression on their faces was familiar. They believed they understood my life. They believed Linda's version of my story. I wondered how many conversations had taken place over the years without my knowledge. How many assumptions had been repeated until they became accepted as fact. A few minutes later, I excused myself and stepped onto an outdoor terrace overlooking the hills. The late afternoon sun painted the landscape in soft gold. A cool breeze moved through the trees below. For the first time all day, everything felt quiet, peaceful. Then I heard voices drifting through a partially open door behind me. Linda's voice, Robert's voice. They were close enough to hear clearly. I had no intention of eavesdropping, but the moment I heard my name, I stopped walking. "She has always been careful," Linda was saying. "That is why we need to approach this the right way." My hand tightened slightly around the railing. Robert sounded nervous. "What if she says no?" There was a brief pause. Then Linda laughed softly. "She will not. Not after everything we have done for her." Standing there beneath the fading sunlight, I realized they were discussing plans that involved me. Plans I knew absolutely nothing about. For several seconds, I remained perfectly still beside the terrace railing. The conversation continued behind the door, each sentence confirming what I had already begun to suspect. Linda and Robert were not worried about my feelings. They were worried about my usefulness. There is a difference. One comes from love. The other comes from need. "We cannot keep delaying things," Robert said. "The bank wants answers." My eyes narrowed slightly. The bank. Until that moment, I had only suspected financial trouble. Now I knew there was more. Linda lowered her voice, but I could still hear enough. "That is why tonight matters. Once everything settles down, we can talk to her privately." Robert sounded unconvinced. "What if she asks questions?" Linda laughed again. It was a soft laugh, but there was something sharp underneath it. "Since when has Eleanor ever asked questions?" The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, because they revealed how she saw me. Quiet, predictable, easy to manage. Someone who would accept whatever version of reality was presented to her. For a long moment, I stared across the hills beyond the country club. The sky was beginning to shift into shades of orange and gold as the sun moved lower. It should have been a peaceful view. Instead, memories surfaced one after another. I remembered lending Linda money when she was 27 and struggling after a failed business venture. She promised to repay every dollar. She never did. I remembered helping care for our mother during the final years of her life, while Linda claimed work kept her too busy. I remembered attending family events, birthdays, anniversaries, and graduations without ever keeping score of who contributed more. Family was family, or at least I had always believed it should be. Looking back now, I wondered whether Linda had mistaken kindness for weakness all those years. Eventually, their voices faded as they moved deeper into the building. I waited another minute before returning inside. The reception was entering its next phase. The band had become livelier. Guests gathered near the dance floor while photographers directed people into family portraits. As I walked through the ballroom, I noticed a few relatives smiling at me with the same familiar sympathy. Earlier, it had irritated me. Now it almost amused me. They had built an entire story about my life without ever asking me a single question. Near one of the side tables, I spotted Sophia speaking with several friends. Unlike most of the guests, she seemed uncomfortable. Every few moments her gaze drifted toward me before quickly moving away. There was guilt in her expression. Not malice. Guilt. That distinction mattered. As I approached, she excused herself from the group and hurried toward me. "Aunt Eleanor," she said quietly, "can I talk to you?" Her voice carried a nervousness I had not heard before. We stepped away from the crowd toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes. "I need to tell you something." Around us, laughter echoed across the room while glasses clinked and music filled the air. Yet in that moment, everything else seemed distant. Sophia swallowed hard. "I did not know about the name tags until yesterday," she said. "And when I found out who suggested them, I could not believe it. I felt my heartbeat slow rather than quicken, because for the first time all day, someone in the family appeared ready to tell the truth." Sophia looked over her shoulder to make certain nobody was listening before speaking again. The nervousness in her eyes reminded me of someone carrying a secret that had become too heavy to hold. "My mother came up with the name tags," she said quietly. "The planner thought it was inappropriate, but Mom insisted it was just a joke." I nodded slowly. The answer did not surprise me. In truth, I had already known. What surprised me was that Sophia had chosen to tell me. "Thank you for being honest," I said. Relief briefly crossed her face. Then she looked down at the floor. "There is more." Around us, the reception continued without interruption. Guests laughed, music played, and servers moved between tables carrying trays of drinks. Nobody seemed aware that the carefully polished image of the evening was beginning to crack. "Aunt Eleanor," Sophia continued, Over the past few months, Mom and Robert have been under a lot of pressure. I waited. The real estate project they invested in lost money, much more than they expected. I remembered Robert mentioning the bank during the conversation I had overheard outside. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. How much? I asked gently. Sophia hesitated. I do not know the exact number, but it is enough that they have been talking about selling property and refinancing loans. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The truth was becoming clearer with every passing minute. Linda and Robert were facing serious financial problems. Yet instead of approaching me honestly, they had chosen a different path. They had spent an entire day encouraging people to see me as someone unsuccessful, someone beneath them, someone whose opinion carried little weight. It was a strange strategy for people who apparently hoped to ask for help. Did they tell you they planned to speak with me? I asked. Sophia gave a small nod. After the reception, I almost smiled. The timing suddenly made perfect sense. Public humiliation first, financial request later. Perhaps they believed lowering my confidence would make me easier to persuade. Perhaps they simply assumed I would never question their motives. Either way, they had badly misunderstood me. Sophia folded her arms nervously. I feel terrible about all of this. I placed a hand gently on hers. None of this is your fault. Her eyes softened. I wanted to tell you earlier, but everything happened so fast. Before I could respond, a voice echoed through the ballroom microphone. The master of ceremonies was announcing the upcoming family speeches. Guests began moving toward their seats. Chairs scraped softly across the floor as conversations settled into expectant silence. Sophia glanced toward the stage. Mom is speaking. First, something about her tone caught my attention. It was not excitement. It was concern. We returned to our tables as the lights dimmed slightly around the room. Linda stepped onto the small stage near the dance floor wearing a confident smile. Applause filled the ballroom. She thanked guests for attending and shared several stories about family. At first, everything sounded harmless. More memories. Light laughter. Then her attention shifted toward me. Families are wonderful because everyone brings something different, she said. Several guests chuckled politely. Linda smiled wider. Some people bring success. Some people bring adventure. And some people remind us that happiness is not measured by financial achievement. Slowly, dozens of eyes turned toward my table. The room filled with quiet amusement. Linda believed she was being clever. She believed she still controlled the narrative. But as I looked toward the ballroom entrance, I noticed a familiar figure walking through the doors. James Whitaker had just arrived. The moment I saw James Whitaker enter the ballroom, I felt something I had not experienced all day. Clarity, not satisfaction, not triumph, simply clarity. James had served as my attorney and financial advisor for more than 15 years. He was careful, discreet, and professional to a fault. The fact that he had come personally told me he understood the importance of the evening. On stage, Linda continued her speech, completely unaware that circumstances were beginning to shift beyond her control. Family teaches us what truly matters, she said warmly. Not money, not status, but humility. More laughter drifted through the room. Several guests glanced toward me again. This time, however, I noticed something else. The reactions were becoming less comfortable. Repetition has a way of exposing intention. What may sound playful once begins to sound cruel when repeated often enough. Linda thanked the guests and accepted applause before stepping away from the microphone. The master of ceremonies announced a brief break before the next round of speeches. Conversations immediately resumed throughout the ballroom. James approached my table with his usual calm expression. "Good evening, Eleanor," he said. "I hope I am not late." "Perfect timing," I replied. Grace, seated nearby, tried unsuccessfully to hide her smile. James took the empty chair beside me. He noticed the place card almost immediately. His eyes moved from the label to my face. "Interesting choice," he said dryly. "That is one way to describe it." He reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed folder. Nobody else at the table could see the contents, but I knew exactly what was inside. Updated trust documentation, asset summaries, several papers requiring my signature regarding a charitable foundation we had been discussing for months. Nothing unusual, yet the sight of the folder reminded me how dramatically perception could differ from reality. Across the room, people believed they were looking at a retired woman who struggled financially. Meanwhile, A legal portfolio containing more wealth than many of them would earn in multiple lifetimes rested quietly beside my dinner plate. A few minutes later, Linda finally noticed James. I watched her expression change instantly. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked very much like concern. She excused herself from a conversation and walked quickly toward our table. "James," she said brightly, "I had no idea you would be here." "Good evening, Linda," he replied politely. "Business trip?" she asked. Something like that. It was a truthful answer that revealed nothing. Linda's eyes drifted toward the folder resting beside him. For the first time all evening, her confidence seemed slightly shaken. "Everything all right?" she asked. James looked at me before answering. "Everything is excellent." Linda forced a smile. A small silence followed. The kind of silence that becomes uncomfortable because nobody knows exactly what information is being withheld. Finally, another relative called her name from across the ballroom. She excused herself and walked away, but not before glancing once more at the folder. Grace leaned closer after Linda left. "She looks nervous." "She should," James said calmly. I raised an eyebrow. That was an unusually direct statement coming from him. He adjusted his glasses and lowered his voice. "Eleanor, before I arrived, I received an unexpected phone call." My attention sharpened immediately. "From whom?" James closed the folder carefully. "From Robert Carter." Across the ballroom, I saw Robert standing near the bar speaking with guests. He looked relaxed, unconcerned, completely unaware that his phone call had just become the most important development of the evening. For a moment, I simply stared at James. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background. "Robert called you?" I asked. James nodded. "About 3 hours ago." Grace leaned forward immediately. "What did he want?" James folded his hands calmly on the table. "He wanted information." I already knew the answer before he finished speaking. Robert had not called to discuss legal paperwork. He had not called out of concern. He had called because he was searching for money. "Information about Eleanor?" Grace asked. "Specifically about her financial situation," James replied. A small silence settled over the table. Nearby, guests continued laughing and enjoying the reception, completely unaware of the conversation unfolding only a few feet away. "What exactly did he ask?" I said. James adjusted his glasses. He introduced himself politely. Then he explained that family members sometimes needed guidance regarding future planning. Grace rolled her eyes. "That sounds rehearsed." "It was," James said. After several minutes, he attempted to determine the approximate size of Eleanor's estate. I could not help smiling at the absurdity of it. Robert and Linda had spent an entire day encouraging people to see me as financially unsuccessful. Yet behind the scenes, they were actively investigating my assets. The contradiction was almost impressive. "Did you tell him anything?" I asked. James shook his head. "Absolutely not. I informed him that all client information is confidential." Relief crossed my mind, although I had never doubted his professionalism. "How did he react?" James paused. "That is the interesting part." My attention sharpened. Across the ballroom, I could see Robert speaking with 2 relatives near the bar. He appeared relaxed, comfortable, unaware that his private actions were no longer private. After I refused, James continued. He became noticeably nervous. He asked several hypothetical questions regarding trusts, inheritance structures, and liquidity. Grace frowned. "That sounds very specific." "It was very specific," James agreed. Then he lowered his voice. "Specific enough that I believe he already suspected there was substantial money involved." I felt a slow wave of understanding. Someone had been searching for information. Someone had connected pieces that were never meant to be public. Perhaps an old business record. Perhaps a mutual acquaintance. Perhaps nothing more than a rumor. Whatever the source, Robert clearly believed there was more to my life than the story Linda had been telling everyone. Before I could respond, movement near the stage caught my attention. The master of ceremonies had returned to the microphone. He announced that several family members would now be invited to share memories and short remarks. Applause filled the room. Then I noticed Linda looking directly toward our table. Her gaze moved from me to James and back again. Even from across the ballroom, I could see tension behind her smile. She knew something had changed. She simply did not know what. The master of ceremonies glanced at a card in his hand and smiled. "And next," he announced, "we have a few words from the bride's beloved sister, Eleanor Hayes." Instantly, hundreds of eyes turned toward me. Around the room, conversation stopped. Chairs shifted. glasses lowered. Linda's expression brightened with obvious expectation. She thought she knew exactly what was about to happen. She believed I would stand, offer kind words, and quietly return to my seat. As I rose from the table, I realized this was the moment everything would begin to change. As I walked toward the stage, the ballroom grew quieter with every step. The microphone waited beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, and hundreds of eyes followed me across the room. I could feel Linda watching. I could feel Robert watching. They both expected a familiar version of Eleanor Hayes. The quiet sister, the predictable sister, the woman who never challenged anything. I reached the microphone and smiled. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began. "And congratulations to Sophia and her husband. I wish you a lifetime of happiness, honesty, and mutual respect." Warm applause filled the room. Sophia smiled gratefully. Then I continued. "Family has been a major theme throughout today's celebration. We have heard stories about success, humility, and how people perceive one another." The room became noticeably still. I glanced toward my table. James sat calmly beside Grace. The sealed folder remained in plain sight. One thing I have learned during my 68 years is that appearances are rarely the full story. Sometimes the person who seems successful is struggling. Sometimes the person who seems ordinary is carrying blessings nobody can see. Several guests exchanged curious looks. Linda's smile had begun to tighten. Earlier today, I noticed an interesting label attached to my seat and my name tag. Nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Nobody seemed certain how to react. At first, I wondered whether I should be offended. Then I realized something important. Labels only have power when we accept them. Silence settled over the ballroom. For many years, people have made assumptions about my life. Some believed I was struggling financially. Others believed I needed help. The truth is simpler than that. I have been fortunate. Very fortunate. I turned slightly toward James. In fact, my attorney is here this evening because we have been finalizing documents for a charitable foundation. James stood politely as dozens of heads turned toward him. The atmosphere changed instantly. Curiosity replaced amusement. Over the years, careful planning and a family trust have grown into assets worth approximately $12 million. For a second, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire ballroom had forgotten how. Then came the quiet gasps, the stunned expressions, the sudden realization spreading from table to table. I looked toward Linda. The color had drained from her face. Robert stared at James as though hoping he would somehow contradict me. He did not. "I share this information for only one reason," I continued calmly. "Not to impress anyone, not to embarrass anyone, but to remind all of us how dangerous assumptions can be." The room remained completely silent. Character is not measured by clothing, job titles, vehicles, or bank accounts. Character is measured by how we treat people when we believe they have nothing to offer us. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smiled. They understood exactly what I meant. I thanked the guests, congratulated Sophia again, and stepped away from the microphone. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger. Not because of the money, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. Within minutes, people who had barely acknowledged me all afternoon suddenly wanted to talk. Some offered apologies. Others offered explanations. I accepted neither. I simply smiled and wished them a pleasant evening. Later, Linda approached me privately. For the first time all day, she looked uncertain. She began explaining that everything had been misunderstood, that the name tags were only a joke, that none of it was meant seriously. I listened quietly. Then I wished her well and walked away. I never gave her money. I never financed her problems. Instead, several months later, the charitable foundation James and I had discussed officially launched. Scholarships were created. Community programs received support. Opportunities were given to people who genuinely needed them. The money accomplished far more than rescuing poor decisions. And every time I think back to that evening, I remember a simple lesson. The people who underestimate your value often reveal far more about themselves than they ever reveal about you.